season to have a conversation with the fabulous curators of Free as They Want to Be, artists committed to freedom. So just a little introduction of here if you haven't been here before, and I'm not going to go through the murals because that's we want to spend our time hearing from Cheryl and Deborah, but we as a museum are committed to the principles of stewardship, education, and sustainability. You are in the atrium of the old Atlanta University Library, and Hale Woodruff created these marvelous murals which are called The Art of the Negro, installed in 1952. You have to take them in. We just had these restored. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our two dignitaries here today. Dr. Cheryl Finley is the director of the Atlanta University Center Art History and Curatorial Studies Collective. She is a distinguished visiting professor of art history at Spelman College and associate professor at Cornell University. Dr. Deborah Willis is university professor and chair of the Department of Photography and Imaging at the Tisch School of Fine Arts at New York University. She's the recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And both of them have published many, many volumes and articles. They are foremost historians of Black photography. First, I would like for you to share with us what was the genesis of your collaboration to create this exhibition, and how did James Baldwin, become a focal point?
Well, I think we would like to start just by saying thank you so much for the invitation, and we're really happy to see all of you here, friends, dignitaries, students, professors, administrators. We're really happy to see you, your friends. And one of the things that's really exciting about our collaboration is that it's been going on for at least 30 years, maybe even a little bit longer than that. And this is an exhibition that actually began and has its roots in a biennial of contemporary photography that actually opened in Cincinnati just last weekend. It's called Photo Focus, and it was the 10th anniversary, and we were invited to curate this exhibition, whose theme was World Record.
Yeah, and the idea of working with artists and scholars, something that's always been a part of our discussion. I was thinking about how artists are researching in the archive, researching in their family archive, and how do we retell the story. So we decided to think about the artists that we've curated, we teach, and ask the question, who ideal people that we wanted to include in this exhibition. There are a few others that we were unable to include because of touring, but it was a fascinating idea to think about Frederick Douglass as one of the most photographed men in the 19th century, and Omar Victor Diop actually recreated one of his most noted photographic portraits. So thinking about Frederick Douglass and his image, but also how Marcus Garvey and the story of Shirley Chisholm, all of these stories, these women's stories, historical women, but also ideas about monuments. How do we consider monuments that we were experienced 2-3 summers ago, and now we're revisiting the experience of monument? But with Baldwin,
we often call this frickin' frack. We're a frickin' frack at Black Portraitures, and we kind of pass the mic back and forth between us. So I'm going to read the quote on which the introduction of Baldwin is based, and also one of the inspirations for the show. And he said, freedom is something that anybody can be, freedom is not something that anybody can be given. Freedom is something people take, and people are as free as they want to be. And this was a quote that was first delivered, you can read this when you enter the show, at the 1960 Esquire Symposium on Writers and Writing in America Today, and it's later in his very famous 1961 novel, Nobody Knows My Name. And we wanted to take this as an opportunity and a springboard to think about the role of contemporary artists in thinking about freedom, especially as Dr. Willis said, at this fraught moment. You know, we've come out of COVID. The show opens in 2022, but for all of the curators and artists and art historians in this room and students as well, you know that if you have a show that opens in 2022, it didn't actually begin. The idea was not conceived in 2022. That happened some years before. So we were coming out of COVID and thinking about, as Dr. Willis said, you know, the way in which many monuments have been taken down and reconsidered, but also the very nature of freedom itself was something that was in question, and I would argue still to this day, especially in the state of Georgia, especially with an election year, this is still something that is very much on the minds of all of us, but also of the artists that are in the exhibition.
Well, can you give us, for those of us who are not as proficient in the history of Black photography, tell us a little bit of the story of J.P. Ball, and then how others have been influenced by him.
J.P. Ball, a photographer that I discovered when I was an undergraduate student. When I studied photography, there were no Black photographers in my history books. I had questioned this young person asking where are the Black photographers. We've studied Black people as laborers, but not as everyday people. You know, so I wanted to ask the question. I did ask the question, and one of my professors suggested that I create a semester-long project. And so I decided to work through the Black press, which was significant for me, to look for ways to find and identify Black photographers. I also decided to go to historical societies. Now, I had no idea how to research. So as an artist, you're free without any restrictions to walk into an archive and ask the question about how can you find a photograph of a 19th century Black photographer? And they're looking at me like, I don't know. So I decided to just kind of go through the magazines of the period. It was Gleason's Pictorial, and found J.P. Ball's photographic studio reproduced in Gleason's Pictorial. But also, Frederick Douglass' newspaper visited in 1855 J.P. Ball's studio, and I want to know who this man is because everyone in Cincinnati and anyone who traveled to Cincinnati visited his studio. So within that experience, I learned that he was born a free man. His mother was free, that he was born in Virginia. He moved to Richmond. He later moved to Pittsburgh, then to Cincinnati, then to St. Paul, Helena, Montana, Seattle, Washington, and he died in Hawaii. But while he lived in Cincinnati, he photographed free Black people there, but he also photographed many of the whites in that community. One of the most significant images that's in this exhibition is a photograph of a young Black woman who dressed as a boy and a servant to two Civil War soldiers because she was escaping to her self-emancipated leaving Kentucky into Ohio. And she visited the studio, and she dressed as a woman, and then the two soldiers are standing with their pistols bravely holding to their chests that they've made it so far, and the photograph was sent back. But they could not identify her because if anyone knew that they were being photographed and that they were helping an enslaved person to freedom, they would be arrested. And so Ball, of course, did not identify her, but I understand there's a lot of research on that photographic image. But when he moved to Helena, Montana, he photographed the first Emancipation Day celebration. there were 3 Black Masonic lodges in Helena, Montana during that time. So we think about migration, especially after emancipation. So these stories just developed over time. I found also later on that when he moved to Seattle, he was in a book called Seattle's Black Victorians. So his photograph was in that book, and there was a celebrated article about his success. And there's my favorite student. Hey, stand up and say hello. Eric Hart studied at NYU Summer High School and graduated 2 years ago, and I'm just so proud of him, and he's from Georgia. Okay. Okay.
Did you want anything, Cheryl?
To add to both.
Well, he was free as he wanted to be. But I think I love the ball connection because Dr. Willis, among her many publications, has written the definitive biography of J.P. Ball, and that was actually quite some time ago in the mid-1990s, as I recall. What? That's true, 1993. Anyway, but it's really just wonderful that question because Ball, spent so much time in Cincinnati, and the connection that I think is so exciting for the show is not just having the facsimiles of his images here, but also the connection in Cincinnati at Photo Focus. But then we have the work that's here installed that shows, this imaginary, photograph being taken by Ball in his studio by Isaac Julian of Frederick Douglass's wife, right? And so that's one of the large color images that's kind of at this end, on the other side of the end cap, and you can see just almost the texture. It's as if you can reach out and touch, her garments and understand the relationship between the photographer and then again, this is this imaginary moment, right? That Isaac Julian considers. And then there are other images in that larger series, but I just love that connection that he's recreating this really significant figure in the history of photography, but also acknowledging Douglass and acknowledging his wife.
And his studio.
And his studios.
Yeah.
And you recreated some of those in your photographs in the show of superimposing images on top of images. Can you talk about that a little bit, Deborah?
Yes, I was invited to create a video on Joan Baez's last album. And I had just finished working on a book on Civil War soldiers and thinking about how do we retell the story and reflect on their images, specifically family images, and I'm just so happy. Where's the wonderful book that you have here?
Would you show the book?
Yes.
Can we hold it up?
Okay.
Oh, it's been passed.
There's so many moments when we think about the Civil War soldier, Civil War families, the people who survived that experience, but also had an opportunity to write letters. And with the song, I was given 10 songs to think about and how I retell the experience. And I've never photographed a video, never created a video, never created a music video, but honored that I was working with a Joan Baez song. And I decided they wanted me to use the image of Obama singing Amazing Grace. And yes, right. And an aspect for me, I wanted to push through the idea of how to think about the Civil War. There was a song entitled Civil War. It was not about the Civil War, the American Civil War, but it was about relationships. And when you hear the video in this exhibition, you'll listen closely, and I invited 2 dancers to reinterpret my experience about conflict, about ownership, about freedom, about love. And so that's all of the experiences that I try to put in the video and then recreate an exhibition with still images with it.
And I'm just going to add something.
Sure, sure.
Just because, but one of the things that that we were invited to do with the initial commission was to think about, while this is a biennial of photography and notably contemporary photography, actually it's also a biennial that focuses upon lens-based art. So what does that mean? It does mean, photography in its original, truest sense, but it also means the moving image. It means images that might use other technologies, like Hank Willis Thomas's Exodus, that uses a lenticular or produces a lenticular photograph that when you walk past it, it kind of moves.
Exodus moves.
Or you move, in the title of the work. But also the idea that many of the artists today, we all, have the access to photography right here, but we also have the access to moving image and film. And there's an obvious and easy jump between the still to the moving in the way that we tell stories and the way that our artists are telling stories. So Adama Delphine Fwandu in her series, creates this beautiful cape and pieces together images that relate from the archives, from histories relating to people like Marcus Garvey, who was always on the move and trying to move people, and others, and photographs herself in the video and in some of the stills with this cape on, performing these different acts, I think, of freedom and emancipation. So that's just one example, and of course Deb's work as well, where you have this need to not just have the still image, but I think in your case, the moving image, the video, was the impetus for that work.
And to think about video and reflections are symbolic, I guess, for me in many ways. But this book by Rita Roberts, who's here, can you stand up and show who you are? But we were both moved by this photograph of a soldier, a young soldier, with his daughters and his wife, and taking them to the photographic studio. I learned a lot. We also found out their names later after my book was published. But I learned a lot about the experience of how do we retell the story, because many of the Civil War soldiers, I can't wait to call you my wife. Mm-hmm. We rarely hear about Black love in the 19th century. And it's always struggle, it's always strife, it's always difficult, but there was love. And the letters that the Black soldiers experienced, I read, and they experienced their loss, but many of the photographs when they passed away or were killed on the battlegrounds, they have photographs in their hand or in their pockets. So this is why this book is important. My book and the reinterpretation of the experience in my exhibition, as well as Willie Williams' photograph. I rarely show my photographs, so I'm really honored to be a part of this exhibition. It's always my written word and written about other people. So this is my opportunity to share my work.
You bring up a couple of interesting points that I'd like you to see if they make sense together. One is the notion that we don't exist in the archives. When you found us in the archives, and I think that needs to be reiterated, because how important is that to the research you've done, Cheryl? Is it the stories or the archives that exclude our histories?
Well, I'll start with Wendell White's installation here in the large installation in the back wall. And Wendell is going into the archives, the objects. And Randall Burkett is here, who is the archivist that I know so well, that has introduced many ways to highlight Black collections around the world. That's really significant. Even to the fact that talking about the archives and objects, that he found, from Philly, so we have to have Philly mentioned in here. And he found Miss Helen Curl, who was a beautician, cosmetologist, hairdresser, who was in school with my mom, who also had a beauty salon in Philly. But I'm looking through the collections that Randall had, and I said that the important aspect of it that he's actually documenting women's work, women who contributed in many ways to their communities. Wendell's gone into the photographic archives as well as material culture to make photographs of the objects. And he says that he's looking at ways to tell the story about someone who migrated from Virginia to the north, and what objects they actually carried with them. And their families, when an older person passed away, they saved those objects. And that's what we can talk about. Terry. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I was just on Wendell. He's prominently displayed at this end, right adjacent to Deb's work. And Terry Atkins' work, who I'll discuss in a minute. But just last, what day was it? Thursday, Lord, anyway. Our heads are spinning. But just last Thursday, we were together in Cambridge at the Peabody Museum, where Wendell White's book, Manifest 13 Colonies, of which there's a copy, I think, inside on the desk. That book was launched, and together with Dr. Lee Rayford, Dr. Willis and I contributed essays to the book. And one of the things that I really enjoyed about writing for that book is that, as Deb was saying, he's gone into the archives, he's found this material evidence that says we were here. He's also found the narrative evidence that we were here. And he's interested in some of the histories and stories. And also, there are books that he's photographed. So one of the books that he photographed is a book called The History of the Rise, Progress, and Accomplishment of the Abolition of the Transatlantic Slave Trade by British Parliament. It has a very long, mid-19th century.
That's real 19th century.
Mid-19th century, actually, early 19th century title, published in 1808 by Thomas Clarkson, who was one of the kind of unsung heroes of the abolitionist movement. And it's a book that I studied a lot for my work, but what I thought was so fascinating for Wendell is that in his research into the archive and to photographing the things that have been of interest to him, he's found some of the same things, like locks of hair, for example. There's a lock of hair of Frederick Douglass. He's also found more than one copy of the book that I just mentioned. In fact, we have here at the Robert W. Woodruff Library at the AUC, we have an entire collection of work that belonged to Thomas Clarkson, the abolitionist I mentioned, who was born in the 18th century, that was purchased under the auspices of John Hope, the president at the time of Atlanta University, from Clarkson's granddaughter, including even a lock of his hair, the medallion of the kneeling slave that was the emblem of the abolitionist movement, and so on and so forth. So there are these kinds of things that you'll find remnants of when you look closely at his images, and they're not documentary images in any way, shape, or form. Rather, you really have to look hard to see what it is that he is photographing before you. And then Deb suggested, right next to the work of Wendell White is the work of Terry Atkins, who was a dear friend of mine and a talented artist. He passed away a decade ago, but he was someone who attended Fisk University, studied printmaking with Aaron Douglas, but also went on to develop his practice in such a way that he was always listening to music, employing music in the work that he did. He was always interested in history, in our history, so he would uplift people that were important to him, like Bessie Smith. And in this example, we have Matthew Henson, who we know is really credited with having discovered, in scare quotes, the North Pole. And so he recreates this journey and recreates and sort of photographs himself as Henson and then also does another video. And the video, if you take a look at that, is a riff on some of the indigenous people who live in that, very cold part around the North Pole. So really interesting work, and Atkins has always been interested in, uplifting and to your question about the archives, pulling out figures that we often don't think about, or we often don't know just a little bit about them.
Or we don't see sometimes.
The memory drugs.
They're there,
Oh,
we
right,
don't see
memory
them.
drugs. That's right. So right next to them, thank you. I've totally blanked on those. Anyway, but right next to the video are these two large-scale images. They're X-ray photographs of memory jugs. And so Terry was, speaking of, as you said, what the artist or what the individual had, perhaps what they prized, maybe when they passed on. So Terry was an artist. He was friends with many artists and scholars and musicians and writers, but he was also an avid collector. And he had amassed a collection of probably somewhere in the area of 50 memory jugs. And he had purchased them, whether it was here in the South or at auction, on eBay, you name it. And these are usually maybe no taller than about yay high from here to here. And it's a jug of any shape, often covered with a substance that will enable you to place onto the jug different objects that are important, to you, to help you remember an individual, or perhaps a religious belief or a spiritual belief. Many often kind of think of them as akin to the Nkisi Nkondi that we often talk about in African art. Yes. And so he took the opportunity in these works to photograph several of them and enlarge them using the X-ray photograph.
Just want to add to that, the experience of the X-ray. I don't know, all of us have aunts and grams. You couldn't touch certain things in their homes. But I always wanted to shake out what was in the memory jug. But, there was a key in there. There's a pair of scissors. There's something in that jug, that the buttons that they saved. But the fact that Terry had it X-rayed and to see the sense of healing sense that the memory jug projected to those who preserve those images, those objects. A button that I read that a woman sent to her husband during the Civil War. She says, I'm sewing this button on your shirt so that every time you close your shirt, you will remember me. You will remember my touch. So that's where I feel that the love story throughout this exhibition is so important.
I think it's an interesting juxtaposition of objects, places, and of course, when you're talking about freedom and being black, the black body. So in your thinking of putting this together, how black artists, particularly because we had the Beast Butler and other pieces, the importance of imagery that particularly in the 19th century, the role photography had in dispelling the myths about black people and how African Americans presented themselves for photography. If you could, I know that was a lot, I went everywhere, but.
No, they're the portraits that are in J.P. Ball's images, and then the portraits that we see in Wendell White's archival discoveries, that people went visited the photographer's studio. There were black people who were not allowed to visit photographer studios in the South, and that they had only certain hours they could enter into the studio. There was one photographer who was an itinerant photographer in Mississippi who was lynched. He was a white photographer who was lynched, and another was ran out of, had run out of town or escaped out of town just before a lynch mob was there to arrest him because he was photographing black families. And the fact that black families, this is during the 19th century, many of them worked certain hours a day to pay for their portraits. And so they also wore their certain kind of dress that they wanted to present with themselves. But what I also love about the images that Delphine created was the hair, that, you know, that these are women who were decided to go to reading the Negro world. And, you know, just imagine this is a black woman reading the Negro world. She has her 2 braids and she's listening to family members talking about how they were going to consider moving to Monrovia, moving to Liberia because of the lynchings in the town. So how these artists are recreating their stories by reimagining their lives of others, stories that were passed down. We see Sadie Barnett, whose father was a Black Panther Party member, but he was he was in the Vietnam War. So the exchange between his experience of he was in the FBI most wanted Black Panther Party list in terms of the archives. So she had a chance to go into the FBI archives, recreate all of the papers and the surveillance that her father experienced. And so we see this in the photographs that she created and the stories that she wanted to explore about her father and how he survived this experience of Vietnam and then coming back to experience the Black Panther Party in Oakland. So these are those family stories, and it happens through Hank was looking at the film by Gordon Parks, which was The Learning Tree. And he experienced it in a different way that I couldn't imagine. That he says that here is the young woman who takes advantage of the young man, the boy. And I didn't even notice this image, this experience, and looking at the film from my perspective. So Hank's thought about how do we think about the Exodus and how we can move from read an image in many ways about survival, about desire, and that experience that another generation is looking at work that Gordon had probably thought about, you know, when he made the film, and many of us who were just looking at the film, just thinking about the storms in the Midwest and the survival of people who've survived the difficult hurricanes in the Midwest, and that's something they experienced, that Gordon experienced often and often talked about in his work.
And look out in 2026, maybe, for
2026. Oh,
I
didn't know that I missed something.
I'm just plugging my friend here. She's going to be publishing a biography of Gordon Parks.
Oh, okay, fabulous. That's all. I didn't know that I had missed something. I did.
I'm on the spot now, right?
Yeah, you are.
I wanted to know that.
Fabulous.
But I was also going to say too, just about this notion of Exodus. I love also the work of Daisha Harris, which is the video that's projected just as you walk in to the right, and this notion of different ways of how we get over, cross over, and the types of routes that we have to take through water, but also thinking about water as a cleansing body and the role of water in religious practices as well. And back to your question, Danielle, about how we see ourselves and photographing ourselves. In addition to the wonderful J.P. balls that are in the show, there's an album of 19th century tintypes of African Americans from about 1870. And there are 50 images in that. You only have the pages open to 2 that you can see, but that's another way to think about, how do we see ourselves? How do we make that effort, sometimes under the cover of night, sometimes at the risk of our own lives or that of the photographer, but to pose before the camera. And I think it is a really interesting relationship an interplay between, again, that Isaac Julian, where you have, the entire studio set up. And this is an album that when I had really no money, that comes around often, but this was way back in the 90s before I, even went to graduate school, but I was working as a curator and an art appraiser specializing in photography, and this album came up for sale at an auction at Swan Galleries. And knowing that it was an album with pictures of African Americans from about 1870, all I could think of was, what is this double, sort of sense of pain, if you will, that it's, the album itself is on the auction block, and one can imagine that some of those people pictured themselves or their family members at some point might have had that experience as well. And so I purchased this album from the auction, and I feel like we were in a conversation the other day, right, with somebody about buying from auction, and I was too afraid to go into the room, so I bid on the phone and was able to get it. But just thinking about, our relationship to these images, but also to the archives and to being able to protect our history and understand its role in being able to tell these stories.
I think it's important to note how Frederick Douglass understood the image and how frequently he had his own portrait taken, if you'd like to.
Yeah, he traveled throughout the U.S. I think there are 3 states that he did not have a portrait made in, but also in Ireland as well as in the UK. But he imagined and wanted people to reimagine, how do we see the black body, the black male body, the black body as human, and the storytelling aspect of seeing photography as biography, that the dress was central for him, what suit, and his wife was a seamstress. So when we think about the collaboration, when Omar created this image of the portrait, he met a wig maker to create the wig. He also was in Senegal and met someone who could create the fabric and design the fabric, and he wanted to tell the story, but he also wanted to think about how the 19th century, when black men traveled, they traveled as intellectuals or freedom fighters, and well-known traveled the world. When we see black men traveling the world today, they're sports figures. And that's why they have these signifiers like the whistle, the glove, when we think about how do we merge the international travel of black men.
And we also have some images of nature in Sheila Prebright's work of nature.
Where's Sheila?
She's here.
Come on, Sheila. Sheila, are you still? Come on, Sheila.
She's hiding in the back. But her use of looking at Stone Mountain, which is, of course, for Georgia, imprints us greatly, but also the other parts of the natural environment. How did you choose those?
Yeah, the idea that, Sheila wants us to reflect on beauty and pain, and having an opportunity to print in black and white, and the subtleness of looking at that story. We walk through images. We look at the cotton, and I know family members who pick cotton and tell stories about the pain of picking cotton, the bent labor, the stooped labor, but also the iconic aspect, how cotton became, the economy of the South and to Europe and clothing and fashion. So the way that I viewed the image of the cotton on the table was iconic for me. It was kind of a revelatory moment for me, but looking the way that she placed it on the table, where we could see it as a religious experience, because so many people died, picking cotton, but also died because they were mistreated by the landowners. So when we see she is a way of seeing cotton as gold in a sense, and that's how it's golden in the way that she photographs that. But then the water. There are waterways throughout this exhibition. There's so many experiences we think about, thinking about land in a way that's ownership for many that could not own land. Many people who experience, when we think of Daisha's experience of how people left going, quote, the North Star through New York, through Canada, but struggling through that water, listening to biblical stories and biblical songs, and that carried them through. And that's where I can see the relationships of the two. The artists in this exhibition are looking at land and memory in an expansive way.
I think that, and this will be the last question, the notion of memory, history, stories, and myth. Can you all play with that, those four things, as particularly as the... I'm going to leave it open. I'm the literary teacher, I can't help it.
How much time we have? Well, I mean, we both, I think, for much of our careers have been thinking about all of those things. Right. Definitely about history, theorizing memory. We've done that. I know you have with you a copy of Dr. Willis's book that has
personal memory versus public.
Right.
I mean, I love that.
Yeah, family history, memory. And so I think that those are threads that always go through anything that we do, whether it's Dr. Willis's own artistic practice or her role as a curator or, photo and art historian, or when we interact with artists. I think that it's really important to consider the relationship between oneself and the archives, stories can be told and also secreted, in one's memory, whether it's through a place-based relationship or an object-based relationship, or even through a time-based relationship. Because, if you look at the installations in the exhibition, where you have the artists who are lens-based, they work in still photography, and they also work in film and or video, or perhaps some of the still photographs are actually not screenshots, but what's the word? Stills from the videos. Thank you very much. I'm looking at Shaw, and she's like, no, stills. But it's also a way for us to kind of, like think again, stop, and realize, and to see what you might not necessarily acknowledge on first take from the actual moving image. But those are threads that are ones that unite us as co-curators, but they also, I think, unite some of the themes of the exhibition, and also unite the artists that were selected to tell the story and to interact with and embrace all of you here today.
And just to follow the idea of memory and how do we, receive it, and the idea of myth. There are myths about storytelling that created a difficult life for many of us. When we think of an artist like Ken Gonzalez-Day, who focused on lynching images, but also growing up in a beauty shop, memory is central. There were so many stories that I heard as a child, listening to the women, some of them who were matrons at the black colleges, who were in charge of the dorms or took care of the girls in the dorm, and they would tell stories to my mom and the other ladies in the shop. And I always thought, I'd love to go to a black college. And then they talked about the stories, what women had to bring to campus when they entered into a black college. And I was a kid listening to these stories, and they were funny and humorous, but then there were stories about survival. Women who had a desire to sing every Saturday night, and then also sing at church on Sunday morning. And then that desire when they had to get their hair done and fixed in certain ways. But the history that I learned, but also the sense of memory through therapy, that women survived because the beauty shop, and they gathered, and so their memory stories created the experience of how do we share and continue to share and tell stories to students today, to all of you, and we continue to make history with this new election. So I want to say thank you.
We've got to. I want to open the floor for questions from the audience. Can you stand up when you ask your question?
I want to ask a question.
Would you also let us know who you are, please?
I ain't nobody. My name is Cheryl Wright Sr. I am a professor here at Clark Atlanta University. I'm in the art and fashion department. My question is in relationship to J.P. Ball and his relationship with painters during the era, especially him being around in Cincinnati. Around that same time as Duncanson, was Bannister around there as well, and what was the relationship?
You want to talk about the backdrops? They painted the backdrops. Duncanson specifically painted backdrops for the studio. He also hand-tinted images for J.P. Ball.
Oh, wow.
And it was important to think about Duncanson in the way that he looked at land in terms of how he reimagined freedom and land. And that's why I think that when we consider the backdrop that photographers created, it was also an imaginary space for people to think about the theater of standing in front of a backdrop, and so that the space became a theatrical backdrop for many to share, and that's part of that sense of desire and movement through freedom, through the landscapes, but also through parlors and outdoor life in the backdrops of many of the Ball studio portraits.
Thank you. In the back?
I'm Shiny Williams. I'm the Digital Humanities Manager here at the museum, as well as a doctoral candidate in Clark Atlanta in the Humanities Department. As you talked about theorizing memory, I sit with your exhibit and I think about the ways that you engage in discovery. So what I'm wondering is what a methodology of recovery would look like, specifically for the portrait book that you have.
You said what would
So I know in the catalog you talk about trying to recover the histories and the stories of the people within the portrait book.
Yeah.
So what would a methodology look like in your work, or if you wanted somebody to uptake that effort to try to tell the stories of the people who were photographed?
Sure.
What would that look like, or what have you done with your research, what are your findings?
Thank you so much for your question, soon to be Dr. Williams.
And he's been giving a lot of tours.
That's such a great question. So, I mean, it is one of the works that I will say is, at the foundation of the way I have thought about photography and memory and have theorized memory. So I told you I purchased it in '92, and at one point, I was saying I was literally trying to figure out how I was going to pay my rent, and almost resold it at auction, but I didn't. So we have it here. But what I wanted to say is when I got to graduate school, I took a class in American Material Culture, and we were meant to do what's called an object lesson, to perform formal analysis on an object, a material object, to try to really understand, what's the metaphor and the meaning behind this object. And that was the very first time I wrote about the album. And I know who the person was that sold, who consigned it to the auction house, but I don't know anything about the individuals. And one of the ways that I've gone about writing about it is to think about things like dress, relationships, the ways in which people are posed. While the people that are in the spread that you see there are mostly grown people, they're photographs of children, there's a theatrical group. It's pretty clear that the album was likely not owned by one family. It may have been put together by someone because there are images that actually date from the early 19-teens, maybe 1920s. And so I've written about it, I want to say about 3 different times. I've also gotten to the point where the last time I wrote about it, and I can tell you where some of the writings are. There was a collection that we did on Frederick Douglass about 15 years ago. It was maybe the first time I wrote about it in a published way, but just wanted to say that one of the things, and now you're reminding me of some work that I probably need to do, that I wanted to do, but is to really, do something that is more speculative. And sometimes, there's, this notion of speculative fiction, right? So to be able to create narratives for these individuals, to imagine what their stories, what their lives were like, what their relationships were to one another. And that's ultimately, when I have the time, that's probably what
Yeah, that would
what
be
I will
great. That's
do.
like Hartman.
I just like the topic specifically doing this as speculative fiction and as a creative writer, that's what I do, so if you want to talk about
Okay, let's talk. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Tim.
Stand up.
My name is Tim Richardson. I am following my wife. No, she's in the arts world. I'm not. So I get to learn and grow by tailing behind her. Dr. Finley, Dr. Willis. I had the mountaintop experience of attending the Black Portraitures experience both in South Africa and in Paris, and I missed the one in Italy. But I understand that, Dr. Willis, that there's something coming up in Tulsa you're thinking about. Can you share a little bit about so we can plan and
Tulsa. What? I gotta get my cowboy hat.
The next Black Portraitures at NYU is going to be held in Tulsa. And NYU is developing a campus in Tulsa and a degree program there. And so we're looking to have papers if anyone's working and thinking about indigenous community, Black Wall Street, it's part of that. And in 26, it's going to be the built environment is the theme, and it's going to be at the Getty, and they're hosting it for us. And if you're in Paris next month, we're having a symposium, one-day symposium, and it's migration and translations. Just thinking about people who travel and how do we consider, how do we translate our lives through migratory stories. And so that's going to be at NYU Paris, November 8th. Yeah, so that's, we love the storytelling moments, from poets who are invited to artists and filmmakers. We want to continue to share our stories that overlap, and they're stories about joy. It's always just another story to share, to rebuild our lives about hope. And I know there's a generation of young people who, one lady said to me, oh, your generation are always talking about hope. So I'm just like, I don't know, I don't understand that. So I looked at her and I said, but if we don't have hope,
What you gonna
what do
do?
we have? So we need to think about your pain so that we can reimagine your life in a different way. And that's the only way that we're going to work together, because that's something that I said, I have Obama hope, and I'm going to keep that. And she was on the attack with me at this conference because she felt that, this generation of Black people just need to stop thinking about hope. And I just can't imagine a life without hope. So, exactly.
That's very dangerous
Yes.
to think about.
Right. And so that's something why I think that, you know, we had parties when my mom and her brothers and sisters had parties every month. They had card parties. They had hopeful moments that just to recreate those stories, just to see a title, I can't wait to call you my wife. You know, that gives me chills to think about a man who falls in love and says that I know I'm going to be free, you know, someday. So that's that sense of hope with love letters. It's something that
They have a vision of the future.
They have a vision of the future.
In which they're alive.
And that's why they that's why they went to the photographic studio. You
Exactly.
know, to preserve that memory. Thank you. This is so wonderful to share this experience with all of you.
Any last question? Yes.
I was just going to add regarding that book, I can't wait to call you my wife. He was an enslaved man, and he's writing to his fiancée. And what is important, I think, in reference to wife is that many enslaved people did not have wives, according to the records.
Right.
Wives were not acknowledged. And so when he says that, this is a double meaning, dual meaning, because he's talking about being free.
Exactly. I will do it legally. Yeah.
Thank you.
My name is Graham. I'm a freshman at the GSU's Clarkson River campus. I was wondering a little bit about, like, I think this question over here, what the retrieval process from archives is like. Like, are you ever, I know the Levant, they seem to have gone to the Dutch archives, colonial archives. Is there ever any resistance, any pushback against Black people going to retrieve their family archives, on top of just it being difficult in general, or anything like that?
I think one of the things I would say sometimes is there can be a difficulty in trying to know where to actually look, where to begin to look, and I think sometimes you can find your family histories in some of the most unsuspecting places in the world. I think that depending on what the topic is, family history, I don't know that I've necessarily experienced any pushback on looking for family history or trying to find stories about some of the historical figures or artists that I've researched. But sometimes it might be the topic that you're looking at. So if you look at the work of one of the artists in our show, Sadie Barnett. She grew up in Oakland. Her father was an enlisted man, a soldier, but he was also a Black Panther, and he was someone who was followed by the FBI, and his files are all, very redacted. So I think for her, one of the processes that she's used as an artist to be able to get closer to her family, to her father, to his history, and to that part of their family history is to actually do the very difficult work of trying to decipher those redacted files. And she is able to do that difficult work through her own practice as an artist. So I think that's one way to maybe think about it through the exhibition. And I'd say the other thing I'd say too, this is getting back to Dr. Williams, soon to be Dr. Williams' question, but also looking at even the work of someone like Isaac Julian in the exhibition. There's a little bit of speculation that Julian engages in, right? And it's not like he was getting pushback for trying to understand what it might have been like to recreate J.P. Ball's studio per se, but there's also this extra leap of faith, this engagement with hope in the future to actually try to imagine what it was like to have that experience, and what it would have looked like for us today. And I would say, in thinking about some of the artists in the show, it's really how they are engaging with telling these stories and engaging with memory, engaging with material aspects of the archive to make them relevant to us today. So it's through this, idea of Black futurity, through hope, through freedom, but also understanding, this touchstone moment when some of these histories or narratives or archives become like red hot. They're archives that we have to access now, here, today. We want to know what's in them, and we want to be able to activate what's in them because we know we need to move ourselves and the next generation and the generation after that forward now, today. So that's my answer. I don't know if you want to add.
Thank you.
And I think I would just add a little bit. Sometimes it's the language and the finding aids that can obscure your being able to find something that's in the archives, but the way it's cataloged, you can't find it. Generally, librarians love to have people come visit them in the archives. It's not like a million people are banging on the door, but you have to do more digging and look way beyond what you thought you might have to look, because the finding aids and the language can obscure what is the content. And we find that even as we're digitizing the art, we're having to change the language, so we will create finding aids that will allow the metadata, that would allow people to find a person in a picture, and it's hidden by the language sometimes more than it is the image. But we want to thank
you,
Dr. Willis and Dr. Finley for spending time with us today. Feel free to go into the exhibit, enjoy for a while.
Oh, talking about memory.